that obviously is influencing the German corporates. If you say analogously, China has the same sort of thinking in terms of we used to be export driven. Now we have to look at away from the West. Potentially, they could still be somewhat export driven and, corral their resources in the Asia Pacific region, get people, countries on side with China, create a larger Chinese sphere of influence, if you will, from an economic perspective. Is there any sort of talk about that happening with China deepening its relationship, the Belt and Road type of thing within Asia itself?
I think very much so. And I think that, well, since you mentioned the Belt and Road, obviously, the Belt and Road, it's not quite living up. I'm not surprised by this, but it's not quite living up to the hype that we heard a lot of, in 2016 to 18. But, it's a signature part of President Xi Jinping's foreign policy. It's not as coherently top-down thought out as I think some people like to think, but, it fulfills a number of different purposes for China. It's designed to protect, supply routes to China. They're building out what the Indians call the string of pearls around the Indian Ocean of ports and naval facilities to protect oil shipment routes, through the Malacca Straits and up to the coastal provinces of China. It fulfills a function in terms of exporting a little, overcapacity of steel and other heavy industry products from China. It's a very useful way, at least this is what the Chinese think, to basically build infrastructure in Africa, Asia, parts of Latin America, Eastern Europe, and then basically use that as a platform to sell Chinese products and market Chinese brands. So, when we were talking before about Huawei and about whether the Five Eyes or Europe and so on would kind of go along with it, but whatever we, quote unquote, we in the West decide to do with Chinese technology companies, obviously there's a whole third world or, emerging world out there, which, is open season for basically Chinese companies and for American and European, Japanese, Korean companies to compete over. So for the Chinese, I think the Belt and Road is, including Asia, is very, very important in terms of economic reach in the future. I think in Asia, it's kind of interesting, really, because I think Asia represents a very kind of curious kind of mixture of opportunities and risks for China, because most Asian countries, even from Japan all the way down to Australia, actually, they see obviously their economic interests as having been firmly kind of rooted in Chinese economic emergence and eruption and so on. Okay, we don't really know how rapidly that will, or how continuously that will go on in the future, because there may be roadblocks to growth and there may be, constraints on Chinese economy in the future that we didn't have before. But be that as it may, China certainly is seen as being sort of integral to the economic outlook. But from a political and security point of view, mostly, I would say still, Asian countries look to the United States as being their, I was going to say savior, I don't really mean savior, but as their backstop. It's basically, right. United States security is still the kind of default. Now that it could change, obviously, nothing is necessarily forever, but this conflicted situation, which a lot of Asian countries find themselves in, I think is quite awkward. I don't think it's like that maybe for the Australians or the Japanese or the Indians anymore. But for smaller Asian countries, ASEAN countries and so on, it's difficult, right? You have to make this kind of trade-off. I'm kind of hopeful. I say hopeful not with any kind of insider knowledge about it, but I was just reading recently about a change of heart in terms of Indonesia, where there's been a kind of a shift in government policy to be more welcoming to companies that want to diversify out of China or away from China and establish. Malaysia has been a beneficiary, for example, but Indonesia so far has not been as in the forefront, but it looks like it wants to kind of join that fold. So, yes, of course, Asia is China's backyard from an economic point of view, but it remains to be seen, actually, how open that backyard will be.
Interesting. Immediately I think about the Chinese domestic economy from there. If it's not immediately obvious that they're going to benefit from a larger Asia Pacific type of strategy, then obviously it's the domestic side. And you were talking about the domestic side. I think that the thing that comes to mind for me is you were talking about a continued slowing of the domestic economy. And I want to get into that. What is it that is causing the slowing? How much is debt, especially private debt, a part of that? And what are the nuances in that?
I mean, I suppose all of our kind of economic kind of discussion actually should basically absent 2020 and 2021, which is, these numbers are going to be all over the place, right? So, we've had, a big crunch in Chinese growth in the first half of this year. Probably, next in 2021, don't be surprised if you saw a double-digit GDP again, but if you average it out, what's happened between 2020, 2021, most probably, the number will end up with something that's about 6%, which is where the growth target probably would have been set had they done that in May. But they abandoned the target for this year, as most people know, because of the inevitability of not compensating for the effects of COVID and so on. So the feeling that I have, certainly, looking at China over the next kind of 5 years, 10 years or so, is a number of kind of headwinds, which I've detailed in the book that I wrote couple of years ago, which came out in paperback last year as well, Red Flags, which is, first of all, the debt situation, right? So we know from Rogoff and Reinhardt and, numerous other economists that have waxed about this since 2007, 2008, debt is a constraint. At the very least, debt is a constraint on growth over the medium term. So that's kind of place where I start, really. And I think that notwithstanding the fact that between 2017 and 2019, China did take, and it would be churlish not to, give them a kind of a round of applause for this, but they did take quite seriously the idea of trying to reduce egregious forms of risk-taking in the financial sector, which had been rampant in previous few years. So that brought down the pace of credit creation and the growth of debt quite significantly. The shadow banking sector, for example, shrunk by about 20 percentage points of GDP between about 2017 and 2019. Part of that was risk being brought back on balance sheet, but part of it was just risk being cut out altogether. So there were 2.5 years, roughly, of relative stabilization of debt to GDP. But since the end of last year, and certainly during the first half of 2020, it's kind of gone, if it's not a moonshot, then it's risen again quite rapidly. So if you look at the broadest measures of aggregate financing, as they call it in China, to May, the rate of growth over the last 6 months was about 14% per annum. Over the last 6 months, about 18% per annum. So now you're talking about credit growing at, high double-digit number again, and GDP growing at low single-digit. So obviously the debt ratios are going to get worse. The funding problems that a lot of smaller banks, there are about 4,000 small banks in China, many of which have quite seriously stretched funding situations, very reliant on overnight funding, short-term funding. About 6 or 7 banks had to be rescued or taken over last year. This year, we've had at least 4 banks that have had a run on their deposits, which have had to be stabilized by local authorities. So, yeah, I think the financial system is still vulnerable, although not necessarily, Lehman inclined, because no major banks are going to be allowed to go bust. It will take a long time, I think, for China to get control over indebtedness. And I think if it doesn't, then It's going to retard the rebalancing of the economy, and it will continue to lean on growth in a very, very material way.
Right.
It's not the only constraint, but it's one of the most urgent ones. Yeah.